Welcome, everybody. So our talk this evening is about urban orchards. It's being given by Lucy Houliston. She's undertaking an MSc at Royal Holloway University, and she's involved with the Orchard Project, looking at London's urban orchards. She's an explorer and zoologist, a speaker and a writer, and I'm really looking forward to hearing her speak this evening. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand you over to Lucy.
Hello, can everyone see that?
Yes, that's perfect. We've got your little person with their snail at the moment.
Yeah, so back when I was at primary school, I was a quiet, bookish goody two-shoes, except the books I read from cover to cover and out loud to my long-suffering English classmates and teachers were insect ID guides. And I did, I'm ashamed to say, get a detention once for sneaking into an off-limits area of the playground to stroke bumblebees. And it will probably come as no surprise to you that this slightly nerdy 6-year-old that you can see on the screen here, that's me, grew up to become, as Maria said, a zoologist and wildlife and conservation focused digital content producer and speaker. And over the past few years, I have been involved in loads of different creative projects whose main aims have been to help champion often odd and overlooked wildlife and generate support for their conservation. I've studied, researched, helped to rescue and rehabilitate, written, spoken, and made videos about all kinds of weird and wonderful creatures that can be found living in some quite far-flung and remote places. Things like tropical moths, salamanders, salmon, and sloths. But the thing that I always come back to and that I've always loved the most, and the thing that first sparked my interest in the natural world back in my small suburban childhood garden in East London, is the wildlife that can be found living right on our doorsteps. And for most of us, that means the wildlife living in our towns and cities, our urban wildlife. And it's that love a couple of years ago that led me to decide to return to Royal Holloway, where I got my zoology degree in 2023, to continue studying part-time for a master's by research focused specifically on urban ecology. And I'm really excited to be here tonight to talk to you about the work I have been doing over the past year and a half as part of my MSc to help us understand more about the value of urban environments for wildlife conservation, and more specifically, the role that London's urban orchards might play in conserving threatened insects. So I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with some of the challenges that urban environments pose to our wildlife. These challenges include road traffic, different forms of pollution, so light pollution, noise pollution, chemical pollution, elevated temperatures, competition with and predation by introduced and invasive species, and the removal of vegetation and its replacement often with bare impermeable surfaces like roads and buildings and pavements. And closely linked to that vegetation removal and the replacement of that vegetation is a process known as habitat fragmentation. And I wanted to delve into that in a bit more detail now because it's a challenge that my research addresses and one that we'll keep coming back to throughout the talk. So what habitat fragmentation essentially is the breaking up of large, intact, resource-rich swathes of habitat, and usually we're talking about green leafy places, into smaller, more isolated pockets or fragments that, generally speaking, contain less food and fewer nesting and sheltering spots for animals. It can also be difficult for certain animals to move between remnant habitat patches in search of things like food and mates. And remember, it's that movement of individuals along with their genes that maintains genetic diversity and keeps populations healthy and better able to adapt to challenges like climate change and novel diseases. And to add to that, the conditions within these habitat patches tend to be a bit harsher than they would be in larger areas of habitat. So hotter, colder, drier, windier, more changeable generally, because there's less protection from surrounding vegetation. And that means the centers of these patches are much more exposed to the elements. And it can be helpful to think of these little fragments. And you can kind of see one there on the right-hand side. That's an orchard in a park. You can see that it's surrounded by concrete, and it is helpful to think about these as sort of islands, but instead of being surrounded by sea, they are surrounded by lots of lots and lots of glass and concrete. Now, given these challenges, and that wasn't an exhaustive list, unfortunately, you probably won't be surprised to hear that urbanisation, so the transformation of natural areas into built-up environments, is a recognised driver of insect decline. And I don't want to dampen the mood by bombarding you with, loads of scary statistics about the rate and scale of these declines. I'm sure a lot of you will have come across many of these, but I did want to draw your attention to a few of the figures I have up here on the screen. What I find particularly concerning personally is the fact that declines among the insects and invertebrates more broadly, so animals without a backbone, tend to get overlooked or are overshadowed by the declines we see reported in other more popular or appealing species like birds and mammals. And it's a concern because insects are enormously important as pollinators. Around 3/4 of the crops we eat depend on insect pollination. They're important as decomposers, as nutrient cyclers, and sources of food for thousands of other species. And also there's evidence to suggest that we are losing insects at much faster rates than we are vertebrate species. So I assume lots of people watching live either in or near a city, but you're probably thinking now, what can I do about these problems? You've just spoken at length about how terrible urban areas are for wildlife. Well, I want to go back and reframe things a little bit now, because cities aren't a complete lost cause when it comes to wildlife conservation. In fact, they're far from it. Now, what you're looking at...
Sorry, can I just interrupt, Lucy? We just got on the top of your screen the little sign about the meeting being recorded.
sure.
Is it possible to click that and see if we can get rid of it? Because I'm trying, I can't seem to control it from my end. So I think it might be on your screen. It's just a couple of people have popped into the chat.
Just going to exit that and I can close it.
And then there's a, and then that okay. Can you click?
Oh,
I don't know. Is that going to make any difference?
The thing is, I can't, for some reason, I can't get my... Oops. Okay, something strange is happening. I'm going to try sharing again because it won't let me control the PowerPoint from my... Is that better?
Yeah, right. Okay, that seems to be it.
Yep, good.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
No problem. Yeah, so what you can see here is a map of London's wild spaces. The green bits show vegetated areas and the blue bits show water. And you might be surprised, I certainly was, by just how green it is. So almost 50% of London is made up of either green or blue space. We have 250,000 miles of road verges and 430,000 hectares of gardens. And it's incredibly biodiverse. So moving away from insects for a second, 11 of the UK's 18 species of bat, another of my favourite odd animals, have been recorded in London. And according to the British Trust for Ornithology, over 360 bird species have been recorded here too. And there is a growing body of evidence that shows how cities, particularly their green spaces, can act as a really important source of shelter, food, and nesting materials and nesting sites for lots of different insects. And another thing that's worth mentioning when we're thinking about the conservation benefits of cities is that they present us with all kinds of opportunities to help connect more people with nature and encourage and support more communities to engage with those sort of wildlife-friendly actions. Because even though they only cover about 2 to 3% of the Earth's surface, urban areas are the places where most of us live. So 55% of the human population currently lives in cities. And that figure is even higher in the UK, where 84% of us live in urban settings. Now, there's no getting around the fact that cities are always going to be here. And while they are designed primarily for the benefit of people, our lives do, of course, benefit and depend upon nature. I've already mentioned some of the essential services that insects provide. So for the sake of us and all those threatened species I gave a nod to earlier, what we really need to be asking is, how can we make sure that our cities are benefiting not just people, but wildlife as well? And that is the type of question I'm hoping to answer with my research, focusing on one type of urban green space that not only seems to have real potential in terms of its value as a wildlife habitat, but that also offers us so many benefits. Things like temperature regulation, soil quality improvement, the removal of carbon dioxide from our atmosphere, and the provision of healthy food. And that is, of course, the urban orchard. Now, I came across this lovely little quote in a book that I read recently that I think does a fantastic job of capturing just how unique orchards are, especially in the way they present a kind of collaboration between people and nature. And I'll read it to you. It said, "An orchard is not a field. It's not a forest or a copse. It couldn't occur naturally. It's definitely cultivated. But an orchard like this doesn't override the natural order. It enhances it, it dresses it up, it demonstrates that man and nature together can, just occasionally, create something more beautiful and literally more fruitful than either could alone." And I love that because it speaks to one of the main reasons I felt so drawn to orchards as a study ecosystem in the first place. There are so many benefits we derive from them, all the more obvious ones I've already mentioned, the more tangible ones, but also lots of social and cultural benefits too, especially in terms of history and heritage and folklore, that at the same time, their very existence depends on us. We depend on each other. But I'm going to be talking about orchards a lot over the next half an hour. So what exactly is an orchard? Well, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, an orchard is any piece of land where fruit trees are grown. And I did dig a little deeper and come across another less loose definition that says you need at least 5 fruit trees for a patch of land to qualify as an orchard. Either way, it's not a very limiting definition, which is great news when it comes to planting orchards in urban environments where space can be extremely limited. And I did want to take the liberty of showing you one more map, which was created by the charity I've been collaborating with on this project, the Orchard Project. It's a map of all the urban orchards they've contributed to the creation, maintenance and restoration of in and around London. And you can see that they are everywhere. There's something like 300 plus on this map, I think. They say a picture paints 1,000 words. This map does a brilliant job of demonstrating just how versatile these habitats can be. Now, excitingly for me, very little research has been done into the role of urban orchards in supporting wildlife. But as I've touched on, there is evidence to suggest that they might have significant conservation potential. Fruit trees are what we call early senescent, meaning they exhibit features typically associated with very old trees when they're still relatively young. And that means orchards tend to offer more of the kinds of environments that insects, these are some of the ones I've seen in my study orchards, really love. So things like rough textured, cracked bark and standing deadwood. Fruit trees also tend to blossom much earlier in the year compared to other trees. So that means they provide nectar and pollen feeding insects with food that might have otherwise been quite difficult for them to find. And thanks in part to these unique features, traditional orchards, and here's an example, they're established orchards in rural locations that are managed non-intensively, and probably the kind of orchards you think of when you hear the word orchard. These traditional orchards support so much wildlife. They play host to more than 1,800 plant and animal species. One recent study conducted across 8 traditional apple orchards in Herefordshire found that they supported highly diverse insect pollinator communities. And in Herefordshire and elsewhere in the UK, we know that these orchards provide a vital habitat to several rare, threatened and nationally protected beetle species, including the very regal looking noble chafer, which you can see on the left there, can't miss it, and the basket longhorn beetle, which is there on the right. So my goal with this project is to survey the solitary bee, bumblebee and ground beetle or carabid beetle communities of around 40 urban orchards in and around London. And for each of these 3 insect groups, I will be recording abundance, so the number of individual insects, and the species richness, so the number of different species or types of insects. And I've chosen to focus on these particular insect groups because in the case of the bees, they're important pollinators, and in fact, without bees, apple trees wouldn't produce very good fruit. And in the case of beetles, they play an important role, a key role in regulating pest populations because most of them are predatory. They're also known to be incredibly sensitive to the environmental changes associated with urbanisation. And both of these groups, the ground beetles and the wild bees, are also fairly easy to sample and identify if you know what to look for. And they're what's known as indicator groups. And this means that the health of their populations, because of how closely they interact with other animals and plants, generally reflects the health of local wildlife communities as a whole. So knowing what types and how many insects live in London's urban orchards is a great start. We don't know much at all about that, but to understand how we can better design, locate, create and manage both new and restored urban orchards in ways that boost insect biodiversity and support conservation, we need to know what it is about those orchards that's attracting or repelling insects in the first place. So to address knowledge gaps there, my project will delve into how select features of my study orchards, in my case, orchard age, orchard size and shape, and orchard connectivity, so the amount of green space in the surrounding landscape, affect resident bee and beetle abundance and species richness. But before I go any further, I wanted to talk a bit more about why I'm interested in these features specifically. So earlier I talked a bit about how habitat fragmentation can impact wildlife populations, and we know that the way animals respond to fragmentation tends to be quite heavily influenced by the size, shape and connectedness of the habitat patch they live in, especially in urban areas. And as a general rule, bigger and better connected habitat patches support more species and larger, more genetically diverse populations of those species. You can see an example of a more connected orchard, one of my study sites. It's at Ladywell Fields in Lewisham on the left there. On the other hand, smaller, more isolated patches, and here's an example of another orchard that's a lot less well connected. You can see it's surrounded by, it's in the corner of that green space there. This is in Brent at Leybourne Open Space. It's in the corner of that green space, but it's surrounded by roads and houses. Smaller, more isolated patches like this one, as a rule, tend to support fewer species overall, and those species communities can look quite different compared to the communities found in larger patches. So for instance, you might have a huge population of one or two very adaptable species, while other species that have more niche habitat and dietary requirements, so the fussier ones, in other words, might be much rarer or unable to survive in a small, more isolated habitat patch like this. So that's why it's worth considering the effects of an urban orchard shape, size and level of connectiveness on insects, because, you know, while there are these general trends, different groups may well respond to these things in different and even opposite ways potentially. But you might still be wondering, why am I so interested in the effects of orchard age? After all, orchards are going to get old eventually, and there's nothing we can do to stop that aging process. Well, based on what we know from studies in traditional orchards and what we know more broadly about the value of old or veteran trees, especially fruit trees for wildlife, we might expect older urban orchards to support more abundant and species-rich insect communities compared to younger ones. And this makes sense when you look at the characteristic features of old orchards. I'm going to take you on a little tour of this old orchard here. This is an old orchard that's over 100 years old in Claybury Park, again, one of my study sites. If you have a look here, you've got these really large trees with large canopies. They've got thick trunks and broad branches, and these offer a lot more surface area, so essentially more space for insects to live, as well as more food for wood, leaf, nectar, and pollen-eating insects. They also have more textured bark with lots of hollows and crevices that are great sheltering places for insects. And where there are larger canopies and older trees, you also get more leaf litter and fallen deadwood, which serves as another important microhabitat. And finally, you tend to get more complex layered vegetation structures in older orchards. You can see here that as you move up from the ground up into the canopy, there are distinct layers of habitat and vegetation, each with its own microclimate. So you can see here how some areas are much more shaded than others because of that thick canopy, and they also contain different sets of resources. And different animals will exploit, different insects will exploit these different spaces and sets of resources in different ways. And the more variety you have in terms of microhabitats and resources, the more opportunities there are for different species, different requirements to coexist without competing with each other. But It's not quite that simple, of course. Ecology is never straightforward. Insects don't play by the rule book. The research, especially in urban contexts, is still very limited, and where it exists, the findings are mixed. So previous studies, including studies focused in other green space types in London, have found that site age can affect insect abundance and species richness in wildly different ways. We know that bees, for example, tend to prefer more open habitats in urban areas, and as we can see here, old orchards are often quite shaded because of their more expansive canopies. And there's another study as well that found that carabid beetle species richness in brownfield sites in the UK actually declined over time, because as those spaces got older, scrubbier plant communities got established, and that actually reduced the number of suitable microhabitats available to those beetles. Whatever trends I observe, though, understanding how insect communities respond to orchard age could help in several more practical ways. If older orchards, if we do find that they support greater insect diversity, then that would really strengthen the case for their restoration and their long-term protection, alongside efforts to plant younger orchards and maintain those orchards into old age. The study's results might also provide strong support for the creation of new orchards if it turns out that younger or mid-aged orchards are better for biodiversity in urban settings. The findings will hopefully also help us understand, once an orchard's being planted, how long it typically takes for it to start delivering those biodiversity benefits that we want to see. And the results might also be used to inform orchard management. So if we see a dip in biodiversity at a certain age, say if bee diversity drops when an orchard hits a certain age and the canopy starts to close, then that's where management interventions like wider planting and more regular pruning might come in. So similarly, understanding how orchard size, shape and connectivity affect insect populations, and by extension, the local wildlife communities, that will hopefully help guide decision making as well around where to locate and how to design new urban orchards. Now that's all the theory behind what I'm doing. Now onto the fun part. Of course, to answer my research questions, I need to collect data. And for me, that data looks like heading out into London's orchards to count plants and catch insects. And there are three main components to each of my on-site wildlife surveys, and the first is a bee transect. So these involve me walking around the orchard that I'm studying at a slow, steady pace in random directions, catching any bees I see flying within a set zone around me using an insect net. And I have drawn quite a bit of attention to myself wandering around parks with this net. The total time I spend actively looking for bees is an hour, but every time I catch a bee, I have to pause my stopwatch so I can then transfer that bee into either a jar or a collection tube so it can be identified in the field or taken back to the lab for closer inspection under the microscope. Now, onto the second key component, which is catching my beetles. The way I collect beetles is much more hands-off and even more low-tech, I'm afraid. I use DIY contraptions called pitfall traps for this. I'm sure some of you will be familiar with them. Maybe you've even made your own. They're just plastic cups that I dig into the ground and fill with liquid, and I use red wine vinegar because it's a mild attractant. And then I cover those with a roof to stop them overflowing if it rains. And I install 10 of these in random locations around each of my orchards and return a week later to collect their contents. And finally, the third key component of my surveys is a vegetation survey. So it's almost certain that my bee and beetle counts will be influenced in some way by the types of plants growing in each of my study orchards, aside from the trees, and how and where they're growing. So I also record the total number of flowering plant species in each orchard I survey, and within a set area around each of my pitfall trap deployment points. I also take measurements of vegetation height, percentage ground cover, flowering plant species richness, and floral density. And I'll largely be taking measurements of my measurements of orchard shape, size, and connectivity remotely using GIS mapping software. So you can see an example of the kind of land use analysis I'm planning to use to measure how connected each of my orchards are to nearby green spaces here. Each of these circles that you see are radii that kind of map onto the typical foraging ranges of different groups of bees. This is all kind of work in progress at the moment. But how is it going so far? I'm just over halfway through my field work now. My plan is to sample more orchards, around 20, between now and the end of September this year. But yeah, so far, and despite the terrible wet weather we had last summer here in the UK, I have managed to survey 23 orchards dotted across 12 London boroughs, ranging in age from about 2 to around 120 years old. You can see a selection of them here. I always say to people, you know, no two orchards that I've been to were remotely similar, and you can see that here, just how different they all are. And so far, me and my lab mate Matty have identified 40 bees representing 26 different species from 11 different genera, and we're still working through those. Now here you can see some of the bee species that we've ID'd, and I thought, since I don't have any final numbers or fancy graphs to share with you yet, I would take the opportunity to introduce you to some of my favourites. So down here on the bottom right, you can see a harebell carpenter bee, and this is the species that's popped up the most in my samples, and it's one of the tiniest. The adults don't get any longer than 7 millimeters. So they're really tiny, and their ecology is really nice because it demonstrates how there can be close links between the health of local beetle populations and bee populations. So these bees nest in the old holes of wood-boring beetles, which is why they have such long, thin abdomens. So that's the sort of end section of the body there. That helps them to squeeze into the long, thin tunnels that these beetles create in bits of wood. And the really cute thing about these, I think, is that the males have a specialized segment right at the base of their abdomens, which they use to grip onto the insides of flowers so they can stop and take naps in them. And they'll often do that if the weather's bad. They'll stop and take a little rest in a flower. Secondly, I want to draw your attention, in case it wasn't drawn already, to that massive bee bum in the bottom left-hand corner. That is the bum of a wool-card bee. And these have become one of my favourites. They are very complex characters. They can be quite moody on the one hand. They chase and sometimes even crush other insects that fly too close to the flower patches they spend their days defending. But on the other hand, they're quite sweet in that they carry balls of fluff around. So they nest again in tiny holes, and they line those holes with tiny plant hairs that they chew off leaves. They bundle together in a big ball and carry back to their nest sites, and that's where they get their name from. And as I've said, it's not just bees that I'm interested in. I'm looking at ground or carabid beetles too. And this summer I have been very lucky. I've gotten to go behind the scenes at the Natural History Museum and work with its senior curator of Coleoptera, Max Barkley, to identify all the beetles I caught during my 2024 field season. And we've got started on some of the beetles I've caught this year as well. I was there just yesterday, actually. And we've now worked our way through all the beetles I caught last year, plus from one site this year, and I can't quite believe it. We have counted and identified more than 1,100 beetles, representing 21 different species. My largest sample was from this orchard, from Hackney Downs, community orchard there. That contained more than 210 individual carabids. This was also one of my most species-rich sites, according to my samples, along with Leybourne Open Space in Brent, which I surveyed just a couple of months ago. And this is quite interesting, at least from the age perspective, because this Leybourne Open Space orchard is just 2 years old, whereas the previous one I showed you, Hackney Downs, is just 17 years old. So there's something interesting going on there. Some beetle species are a lot trickier to identify than others. One is currently having its DNA barcoded so that we can confirm whether it's one species or another. It even confused the experts. And with certain species, the only things that have allowed us to distinguish them from other similar species have been tiny, tiny details, like a single paw near the top of one of the wing cases, or the fact that they have 8 or more rather than just 5 to 8 fine hairs on the inside of one of their back leg segments. A microscope is definitely an essential tool. This was us in action yesterday. There are some, though, that are a lot easier to identify. And one of the beetles I very quickly became familiar with was the black clock beetle. You can see a row of those down in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. It's got these really distinctive, deeply grooved wing cases, very shiny, very dark in colour. It's got quite a long head, and compared to most of the other beetles I caught, it's really quite big. They can reach up to 1.6 centimetres in length. And this was also the beetle I've caught the most of. It showed up in all of my study orchards so far, except 4 of them. And that's thanks to its very broad diet and very generalist habitat requirements. Of course, I'm going to introduce you to some more beetles because I have fallen in love with them over the course of this project. So another of the urban orchard beetles I have become better acquainted with over the past few months is this one. It's the strawberry seed beetle. You can see that its legs are almost strawberry coloured, but it actually gets its name from its habit of munching on strawberry seeds. These are, of course, a bit harder to come by in urban parks and gardens. So there it's more likely to feed on grass seeds. And this is another aptly named but slightly more glam looking beetle. Look at that one. It's the common sun beetle, so called because it has a habit of sunning itself on patches of bare ground. It's only small. And this down here is the digger slope rumped beetle. Again, great name, but this one looks really mole-like to me, don't you think? And that makes sense because it's fossorial, so it's a digging beetle, and you can see that it's really well adapted for life underground because part of its front legs are broadened, and that helps it to push its way through wormholes in the soil. Now, this one looks quite similar to our friend, the black clock beetle that we met just a second ago. And it is indeed a relative of that species. It's a beetle called Abax parallelepipedus, again, strong name. But I've chosen to highlight it here because it was a new species for us yesterday, and it's the largest carabid beetle I've caught so far. So these beetles can grow up to 2.2 centimetres, which is quite a size given that some of the others are the size of kind of tiny pinheads. Finally, my absolute favourite, last but not least, the boggle-eyed common springtail stalker. As its common name suggests, it is a predator that hunts springtails and mites in the leaf litter, but it is unusual among the carabids in that it hunts during the day rather than at night. So yeah, it's a work in progress. Hopefully I can come back next year and share my final results with you all. For now though, Phil beckons. I just wanted to thank everyone who's supported this project so far, especially my supervisor Ellie, fellow pollinator research Matty, who's been helping identify my bees, Max Barkley at the Natural History Museum for all his very generous support with my Beetle ID, and to the Orchard Project team, especially Kath and Sarah, who have been supporting this project and helping me find study sites and spread the word. On that note, quickly, before we finish up, I did want to give a little shout out to the Orchard Project before we finish, because I think their work is really important. I'll drop a link to their website maybe in the chat at the end in the Q&A session so you can read more about what they do and how you can support their work. But over the past 15 years or so, the team there have been busy supporting and working with local authorities and community groups and schools to create, restore, care for and champion orchards in underused urban spaces across the UK. And they've ended up, as you saw earlier, with this huge network of orchards growing in all kinds of places, from housing estates and school playgrounds to nature reserves, national trust gardens and allotments, not just where I am in London, but also in other cities. They've got orchards in Manchester, in Leeds, in Swansea, even up in Glasgow and Edinburgh. And they don't just help fund tree planting, they also deliver orchard management training courses, and they help communities organise events in their orchards, and everything they do aims to kind of enhance and improve people's access to those orchard benefits I mentioned earlier. They want to create these spaces where people can come together and give them improved access to green space and fresh food, and also boost biodiversity through habitat creation and restoration. So there's that little plug. If you are interested in hearing the story behind my kind of connection to some of the plants and insects I am now out and about recording as part of my urban orchard surveys, and learning a bit more about urban bees as well from someone who really knows this stuff. I did recently pop up on the Our Plant Stories podcast. I can put a link to that in the chat, or Maria can share it with you in an email, but it's also behind that QR code there that you can scan. It should take you to Apple Podcasts if you fancy listening to that. Yeah, as I mentioned right at the start, I do also give talks on everything from creative conservation to weird wildlife and media careers. If you'd like to chat to me about that sort of thing, you can contact me via the email address at the bottom. But for research related questions, you can reach me on my university email address, which is the horrible long one, the second one from the bottom. I'm also sharing some occasional project updates over on my Instagram, so feel free to say hello over there as well. But yeah, that's everything. Finally, thank you for everyone for listening, and to the London Natural History Society for inviting me to come and speak tonight. I think we have time for some questions now. I hope. I don't know how much time, but yeah, over to you to grill me on orchids, bees, and beetles.
Thank you so much, Lucy. That was really interesting. And just kind of the map at the beginning, you showed how many of these urban orchards there are, and just in London. I was really quite amazed by that.
I was amazed by that.
So
I
just
didn't
to see
realise.
how, yeah, just kind of see the coverage really. And thank you so much also for sharing your work and the kind of way that you're going about doing the research. And I think one of the things will be really interesting is about looking at those factors in terms of things like the age of the orchards, the location, the connectivity. I think it'd be really interesting to see the kind of impact that has. And obviously the complexity of the fact that you're then going to have maybe different plants growing there, and that will, there'll be a number of reasons why they're going to vary, but to just sort of see how the impact of all of that, I think will be really fascinating. And are you kind of thinking about the I mean, are these orchards all managed in a similar kind of way, or are there different approaches depending on where they are? And
so, I mean, the key thing that I should have mentioned and I forgot to mention is that they're all organically managed. So all the orchards are all organically managed. So that's the kind of similarity between them, but you saw how different they all are. Yeah. Some get a bit more input than others in terms of people coming along and checking the trees and pruning the trees, and there being events in the orchards or planting wildflowers. And I was going to say as well, it's interesting that you mentioned the flowers, because some of them have really rich wildflower borders, and I'm sure that I expect that's going to impact bee populations more than maybe the tree age and other factors like the surrounding landscape and that sort of thing. But that's all stuff that I can kind of account for when I do all my statistical analyses and things like that, when I get down to the sort of nitty-gritty stuff. So it will still be really interesting to see what comes out, but they are very varied, and the main thing that kind of unites them is this organic management. So it will be interesting to see what comes out of that.
Yeah, that would be fascinating. And of course, all the analysis is a whole other part of the project, isn't it? There's going out and doing the stuff in the field, and then there's all the kind of making sense of it afterwards. We've got quite a few questions in the chat, so I'm going to stop the recording in a second before we go on to those. I just did also, could you just mention the name of the book with that lovely quote that you somebody kind of commented that it was a really good book, and it was one I hadn't heard of. So if you wouldn't mind just mentioning that again.
Yeah, I just had a tiny little thing in the text. The book is called The Apple Orchard, The Story of Our Most English Fruit, and it's by Pete Brown. So I'm slowly building a small library of orchard and apple themed books, and that is one of them. But yeah, I thought really nice.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to look out for that one. Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording, and then Anchor, I don't know if you were able to pick up the questions, or if not, I'm happy to do so.
Sorry, I've only got